I handed the flowers over to Patricia, and she was, as I had thought she would be, completely focused on the flowers. It took several seconds for her to realize that not only was there no attached card, but that the flowers she had just been handed had come from her own garden. I smiled at her, my silvered, milky gaze and red-stained teeth enough to make any sane person scream. To her credit, she didn't. She gaped at me, her wide eyes wider than even I'd seen them when she'd stabbed me to death with her own gardening shears. I grinned at her, showing even more of my teeth. "I should thank you, Patricia," I said in my smooth, even tones. "I've never felt this free before, not in all the years I lived. When you killed me, you unleashed something in me that had been struggling to surface ever since I was a little girl." I moistened my lips with my tongue as she backed away, hands splayed and outstretched in front of her as though they could somehow magically ward me off. I wanted to laugh. I did laugh. "Patricia," I cooed. "You can't be here. There's no such thing as ghosts. I saw you die. I saw you die. You're dead. You're not real." "Oh, but I am real, Patricia. You have no idea what kind of can of worms you opened when you decided I was in your way." I took another step toward her, then 2, 3, 4. She was backing herself into a corner and I was letting her, my scarecrow smile cadaverous in the early morning light. "Do you know what zombies eat?" I asked her conversationally. Oh, no," she managed. I smiled, and not unsympathetically. She was rummaging behind her at the kitchen drawers, and I suspected she might be searching for a weapon. I was correct, but I didn't care. She couldn't kill me a second time. I heard a businesslike metallic click as she brought her hand around. The smooth black surface was the same shade my mother's Bible had been. The gun went off, and I felt a dulled impact, but no pain. I looked down at the new hole in my gut, and then grinned back up at her. Patricia looked absolutely terror-stricken. Good. I purred at her as I approached. She shot again, and I began to laugh as I felt another hole being torn in me, this one through a heart that had not beaten blood through my body in hours now. It was useless to me, just another piece of meat. And it was her fault. It was all her fault. I made a grab at her hands, and she sank back against the sink. Momentarily forgotten, the gun slipped through her slack fingers and clattered with a metallic dance to the floor. Patricia chased it with her gaze, but an attempt to recapture it was no longer possible. My hand had closed over her windpipe, and she was using both of hers to try and pry loose my grip. It was not to be. I was the stronger by far. "Patricia." Patricia screamed. She screamed until she couldn't for lack of air. Her nails raked at my hands and arms. I leaned forward slowly, like a lover intending on a kiss. My teeth closed upon her nose, and I loosened my grip enough to allow her a tortured scream. I tore the sensitive tissue away from her face and spat it out. I wanted to eat it, but that would have to come later. Right now, I had other things in mind. The blood on my lips was warm, though, and I knew I could not wait much longer. I was starving. Patricia tore free for a moment, but there was nowhere to run. I stood between her and the doorway, and the angle was wrong for an escape to another room. There was no escape, and she knew it. My mouth was watering as I watched the blood run down the hole in her ruined face. I licked my lips. Patricia dove for the knife she kept above the stove and managed to retrieve a wickedly serrated one, but I reached her and had her wrist in my grip before she could bring it back down. I slammed the back of her hand into the edge of the counter, and it fell away from her nerveless fingers. I gave her a smile that was more snarl than anything and darted forward, ripping away a piece of her cheek while she produced a rather simian scream. The morsel slid down my throat, and she pushed at me with all her strength, but I took her down, and straddling her, I caught one of her flailing arms. She slapped feverishly at my face and head with her free hand, but I took no notice. I relished the thick, ripping sound as my teeth sank into her meaty forearm and tore out a chunk of flesh, thick, wet, and bloody. Patricia shrieked, and blood spurted, warm and slick. I could feel it running down my chin and neck in rivulets, and I nearly moaned my pleasure at the taste. Next, I leaned over Patricia, covering her body with mine and effortlessly trapping her beneath me. She squirmed, but she was growing weak, and even the rush of terror-induced adrenaline was futile against my ravenous appetite. I reached up, grasped a fistful of her ash-blonde hair, and wrenched her head to one side. At first, I only settled my teeth upon her throat. I wanted her to know what was coming. I wanted dread to sweep through her conscious thought on dark wings. This was payback after all, and payback was, as they say, a bitch. Patricia screamed and then went curiously silent, her breath coming in ragged and shallow gasps. I squeezed my jaw closed a little and then relented, goading her deliberately. She gasped, but did not scream again. "Please, she whispered. Please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please don't kill me. I'll make things right. I laughed softly, my tongue caressing her throat beneath the growing pressure of my teeth. I released her long enough to look deep into her pleading eyes for what seemed a long time. I smiled gently. You are making it right, Patricia. You're making it right in the only way possible. I dove forward and tore her throat out then, ignoring her final, cheated scream. She'd stolen my life from me and condemned me to this existence. She'd made me a killer and a cannibal, and now, as the blood finally began to slow and her scream quieted, she paid her debt to me. I tore another chunk of flesh from her throat, and then another, feeling as though I might never have enough. I'd eaten through to the bone, but that wasn't enough. I wanted her brain. I sat up, still astride the body, and regarded her face. She'd been attractive in a homey kind of way. Not beautiful, but if she hadn't been insane, she might have found love one day. I shook my head, dismissing such thoughts. None of that mattered anymore. I'd read a book once that stated the cheeks were the most tender meat on most creatures. I smiled and bent over Patricia again. A few minutes later, her skeletal joker's grin made me giggle. I put my hands over her mouth, the 4 fingers of my right hand on the bottom jaw with the thumb levered underneath, and all 5 fingers of my left hand rested on her upper teeth. I pulled with all my might. Her mouth gaped and gaped, and though I met strong resistance, soon there was a sharp crack as her jaw broke and came away from her skull. I ripped it away, tearing more flesh, and tossed it carelessly aside. I pulled her still dangling tongue free and popped it into my mouth to chew on while I broke Patricia's neck and tore her head free. It took surprisingly little effort. I was gaining strength, it seemed, or maybe it was just that the human body was more fragile than I'd been led to believe. I grasped the stick of spine that was still connected to Patricia's head and wrenched up and backward. It shifted, crackled, and finally came free when the line of bone along the back of the skull, I remembered from a college anatomy class that it was known as the lambdoid suture, funny the information we retain, gave way. With a heavy sucking sound, the tender, heavy brain came free. I discarded the remains of Patricia's upper skull, which rolled over once and came to rest so that those wide brown eyes still stared at me. I paid them no heed as I studied the brain, still warm in my hands. It was still covered in its protective sac, which looked a little like red jello to me. I parted it easily and tore it away as though peeling a particularly ripe and juicy orange. When I finally sank my teeth in, it was bliss. I forgot everything but what I was doing right then and there, drenched in blood and devouring human meat and organs that would suffuse me with renewed vigor. It would lend me with the mask of the living for a little while longer. 3 hours later, after having showered in Patricia's house and stolen some clean, albeit frumpy clothes from her, I was pulling back into my garage. I went in the house, changed, and added the late Miss Dunham's discarded clothing to the other bag and took the garbage out. I whistled a lilting tune as I went back inside. I pulled a plastic Ziploc baggie out of my purse and deposited its contents in the deli drawer of my refrigerator. I'd eaten over half of Patricia's brain but could not bear to leave any of it behind. I'd be hungry again before dark, and if I was going on a date with Matthew, the only way he'd survive would be if I had a little snack in between meals. I waited until 2:30 to return his call. I knew he'd be taking a break around then. He always did at that time, or so he told me.